This study gathered 107 coffee drinkers and split them into either a group that received strong coffee or decaf coffee with an equally bitter amount of a substance called quinine. This was placebo coffee. They ran the participants through a number of tests, and the researchers found the participants were unable to discern if they had consumed caffeinated or caffeine-free coffee. Despite the clear psychoactive effects of caffeine, the participants couldn't tell the difference, and the researchers attributed this to the flavor and the aroma of the coffee, or what Gen Zers would say, the vibe of the coffee. This served as a conditioned stimulus. So taste and smell coffee, consume it, and gain the feelings of alertness even if the coffee is fake. They found these coffee drinkers to be classically conditioned. People who drink 1 cup of coffee a day at any given moment during the day are experiencing increased energy utilization in areas in the brain involved in handling of dopamine, noradrenaline, serotonin, and movement. Their blood flows differently, their mind computes differently. What am I saying? I'm saying that coffee drinkers ain't like anyone else, because there is no drug like caffeine. It readily crosses the blood-brain barrier, meaning it's mainlining straight into our brain and expressing stimulating effects in as little as 15 minutes after our first few sips. It's the most widely used stimulant globally, and there isn't even a close second. Any other drugs classified as stimulants you have to get over the counter, or they have a really bad reputation. Sometimes both is the case. Caffeine is in a league of its own, and we can find it in tea, chocolate even, but when we think of caffeine, we think coffee. 1 a day, 2 a day, 3 a day, we can take an individual and see a clear difference between them with their coffee and without. 2 totally different people. But what gets left out are the changes and the adaptation that takes place in the body of a coffee drinker. There are 5 general taste profiles: bitter, sour, sweet, salty, and umami. Of course, there are different levels of variance here. Different people experience different levels of sweetness. What's sweet to me may not be all that sweet to you. But what's interesting is that this can be enhanced or suppressed by not just genetics, but by environmental factors. Researchers took a bunch of coffee drinkers and arranged them into groups consuming either caffeinated coffee or placebo caffeinated coffee. They found the caffeinated group to have a 30% decrease in sweetness perception, and sweetness perception alone. When it came to the other 4 profiles, they were all perceived similarly, whether the coffee drinkers had caffeine or not. So why is this? This is interesting because coffee is bitter, but specifically caffeine is bitter. So we would think that the bitterness would just mask out or blot out the sweetness and have some kind of masking effect over our taste buds, but that's actually not the case. Our taste buds have what we call adenosine receptors. Caffeine has a well-documented ability to bind to adenosine receptors and make its impact. Congratulations, you just unlocked the greatest achievement of coffee there is to unlock, and that is knowing what the heck it does. You see, the body is simple. It works by what we call receptors and pathways. We have receptors and pathways. So when a receptor is activated, we travel down a pathway. When I was coming up, I played a game called Chutes and Ladders. It's based on the ancient game called Snakes and Ladders, which the 2 are the same game. We just call it Chutes now because we're soft. With Chutes and Ladders all over the board, you could have a pathway take you anywhere, but you can only take these pathways if your character lands on the appropriate spot. Oh, come on, if you get it early. The body gets things done by pathways, but they are only signaled when a character lands on the appropriate spot, and that is a receptor. Adenosine receptors signal a drowsiness effect when they are activated. Now, unlike Chutes and Ladders, you can't just randomly land on a receptor and activate it. It has to fit specifically like a lock and key. The character here is adenosine. It's an endogenous or homemade molecule that fits in adenosine receptors. Caffeine is so molecularly similar to adenosine that it actually lands in adenosine receptors, but they don't activate them, they just kind of block them. So as the day goes on, adenosine builds up in the body but can't activate its receptors because caffeine is in the way. Caffeine taking up this spot in adenosine receptors is probably the most pronounced mechanism turning a coffee drinker into a coffee drinker. Okay, so often wondered is if coffee drinkers have to drink more coffee in order to get their desired effect, right? Do they build up a tolerance? Well, you remember those adenosine receptors we were just talking about? They are on virtually every cell in the body. What's the significance? They're important, and they impact more things than we realize. Interestingly, researchers continually find that these adenosine receptors, they can be upregulated in the presence of a bunch of antagonists. What are we saying? View it this way. Caffeine comes over, blocks the receptor. It's not activating anything, just antagonizing the results of if adenosine were to bind there. Therefore, we call it an antagonist. But we need those receptors for very important things like vasoconstriction and vasodilation, or the tightening and widening of our blood vessels. That's a big deal. So the body doesn't just let caffeine take completely over and just block it out. In the presence of high levels, it adapts and adds more adenosine receptors. That's like if someone was using the bathroom in your one bathroom home and you had to pee, and instead of waiting for them to finish, you just go and build another bathroom. Totally realistic thing that can take place. Blink and you'll miss it, but this is tolerance building. Now that there are more adenosine receptors, now that they're upregulated, adenosine has more landing area. Thus, more caffeine would be needed to take up those spaces before adenosine gets there. This is, at least theoretically, and at most definitely, what's behind some of us needing just a little bit more coffee in order to get that desired effect. This tolerance can develop in 5 days and drinking as little as 2 cups a day. So that means in just 1 work week, we can develop a coffee tolerance or caffeine tolerance that wasn't even there before. We mentioned vasoconstriction and dilation. So the question is, how does this tolerance impact a coffee drinker's blood flow? Hey, editing Johnny here in a dark room with a half-naked desk. I spilled something. Just thought this would be a good and proper time to take a break from the video and say hi. Oh, leave a like! You guys never hear me ask for that too much. Leave a like. Okay, all right. Adenosine receptors in the brain produce vasodilation, that widening of the blood vessels. Sensibly, if caffeine comes along, we don't experience that same level of vasodilation because of caffeine's blocking effect. This is specifically for our cerebral vasculature. We have to make that distinction because adenosine receptors represent both vasodilation and vasoconstriction. Confusing, right? But let's think of it this way. Caffeine basically comes along and performs the opposite action of adenosine if it would have taken up that area. So that is to say that if adenosine dilates here, caffeine comes along and constricts here. If adenosine constricts there, then caffeine comes along and dilates there. Because of this antagonizing from caffeine, if we have about 250 milligrams of it, we're going to decrease cerebral blood flow up to 30%. Now, this is a little funny because when we think of caffeine intake or coffee intake, we think, oh, stimulating energy. But we hear decrease in brain blood flow doesn't really sound all that stimulating. But what's interesting are the effects that take place after you put the coffee down. Around 20 to 24 hours, so about a day without coffee, caffeine is just about cleared from the blood. We'd have all these adenosine receptors in greater number because of that tolerance we built up. And like a flood, adenosine crashes back to where it belongs, cerebral blood flow rushes back up, we experience headaches, fatigue, flushing, and anxiety, otherwise described as the abstinence syndrome. Okay, I gotta swap out my chair. It's squeaking and it's getting annoying. Become a Patreon member, contribute to the new office chair fund. No! I spilled some of it. I elbowed it. All right, let's give it a taste. Okay, so for the first time, I am trying Stay Salty Coffee. It's a simple recipe from LMNT. If you've never heard of LMNT, if you're someone who is adding electrolytes to their diet or are looking to, you should be using LMNT hands down. 3 important electrolytes: sodium, potassium, and magnesium. There are many flavors to choose from. I keep the chocolate ones on me. What's cool is that you can enjoy these hot. So the coffee drinkers get to have a little fun here, adding this to their mix. Throw those bogus sugar-laden energy drinks away. This is the ultimate pick-me-up. I'll tell you why. We talked about caffeine and its ticket past the blood-brain barrier and its subsequent impact on the brain. But you know what else has a ticket past the blood-brain barrier? Electrolytes. But electrolytes aren't like caffeine. They aren't antagonizing any receptors. They are straight up essential. The brain is calling for them because they power every single nerve impulse. That means our ability to move and think, basically our ability to be human. What's often misunderstood about electrolytes happens to also be what they have in common with caffeine. Neither of them give us energy. Okay, so this is still an ad read, but this is just important information at this point. Caffeine's effect on our adenosine receptors doesn't influence energy production at all. So caffeine isn't actually giving us energy, but what we're actually doing is stunting drowsiness. But since energy is arbitrary and subjective in the way that we talk about it, we can actually on paper say that it gives us energy and still be correct. I'm just being highly technical here because electrolytes also suffer from the same misunderstanding. Electrolytes don't give us energy, they supply demand. Simple economics, our body demands salt in varying amounts depending on what we do. Our job is to supply it. If you're sitting around all day eating salt-laden processed foods, don't worry about taking LMNT, you're probably already getting your salt quota. But if you're somebody who is exercising, taking up fasting, you're sweating all day, or your job requires you to be a brainiac, right? Anybody who thinks they could benefit from extra electrolytes, I do recommend LMNT. There are a bunch of different electrolyte companies, none as convenient or as tasty or as industry leading as LMNT. You can get a free sample pack using the link in the description along with any purchase. Get yourself some of that stuff you can enjoy hot. Join the chocolate train, all right? They got different types of chocolate, all kinds of stuff. They also have these sparkling canned drinks. The reviews are out of this park. I totally recommend. They are awesome. Thank you, LMNT, for being a channel sponsor. All of this conversation on hydrating and liquid may have you wondering about a popular subject involving coffee. Does it make you pee more? Coffee makes us pee. Asterisk. This review found it does for people who are new to coffee. It makes you pee a little more for a short period of time, so it has a reputation of being a diuretic, but really only kind of. Habitual coffee drinkers have actually developed a tolerance against caffeine's diuretic effect. Again, coffee drinkers are just different. But honestly, I'm not too sure that coffee has a diuretic effect at all. This geniusly designed study took 98 coffee drinkers and allowed for strict fluid intake of either 4 mugs of coffee or 4 mugs of water a day for 3 days straight. Then flipped the groups and did it again. A direct comparison, and it didn't keep these folks in a lab, you know, in order to mimic the real world a little bit more accurately and probably make the study a little cheaper as well. They controlled for a whole bunch of stuff, and what they found was so interesting. There was no difference in total body water between the two groups, and they peed the same amounts. The only relevant difference the researchers observed was coffee drinkers got rid of more sodium when they peed. And it's because of those dang adenosine receptors again. They're also involved in fluid balance at the kidney. Caffeine comes along and decreases the amount of sodium reabsorbed. But while you look at that, a cup of coffee has comparable hydrating effects to that of a glass of water. Tap water, to be specific, is what the researchers gave the participants because it has a little bit of solute in it. If they were given purified water, we'd be looking at totally different results because of its flushing ability, but this gives a little bit of reason why coffee drinkers are okay adding just a dash of salt to their coffee, or sprinkle it with chocolate salt. This study took 30 healthy coffee drinkers and subjected them all to 5 different tests with a week to separate the protocols. Protocol went as such: get caffeine levels measured, get blood pressure measured, drink either 2 cups of either regular coffee, stronger coffee, decaffeinated coffee, hot water, gross, or drink nothing. Then have blood pressure measured again. They did the same protocol for 8 unlucky souls. They had abstained from coffee at the start so they can get more balanced results. What the researchers found was interesting. They report there is indeed an increase in blood pressure only in a couple hours after intake of their regular and strong coffee. So coffee does indeed induce an increase in resting blood pressure. However, those that had greater levels of caffeine in their system had less increase in blood pressure. In other words, the longer they went without coffee, the greater their increase in blood pressure after they returned to it. Those that had caffeine in their system at the time of the measurements had negligible increases in blood pressure, if any at all, suggesting there's an adaptive blood pressure response for coffee drinkers. But wait a minute, Johnny, maybe we don't see an elevated blood pressure in those that have caffeine in their system because they already have caffeine in their system, so it's probably already elevated. Well, I thought the same thing until I reviewed this study. They brought in 18 folks and also found that the increase in blood pressure following coffee intake was dependent upon caffeine levels in the blood prior. But the way they set the study up was brilliant. They ensured blood caffeine levels were 0 as they had the poor coffee drinkers go without caffeine for 21 days prior to the study. They then gave them a placebo drink with every meal for a few days, then gave them caffeine with every meal for 6 days straight, then back on the placebo drink for the final few days. That design yields this figure. You can visually see that when the coffee drinkers returned to caffeine after their long break, their blood pressure shot up. But the effect was transient, not lasting long, temporary, as their blood pressure stabilized to prior levels after only 2 days. And they weren't drinking casually. They were given 250 milligrams of caffeine 3 times a day. You do the math. This is elite level caffeine intake, and their blood pressure did not budge. Intuitively, we would expect their blood pressure to drop after they leave caffeine. But as you can see, blood pressure remained the same after the coffee drinkers went back to the placebo drink. So habitual coffee drinkers are impervious to these blood pressure increases that are seen from caffeine, but this adaptation is lost after over 24 hours of abstinence. In other words, skipping coffee for a day won't completely wash out your ability to have your blood pressure unmoved from coffee, but basically from about that point on, you start to see a time-dependent or corresponding greater and greater blood pressure response for when you do eventually return back to coffee. It's kind of like the slingshot effect, right? So after 1 day of coffee abstinence, your slingshot isn't just pulled all the way to the max. Each day probably has a little bit of a further pull on the slingshot, so when you do eventually return back to coffee, you're going to see a corresponding rise in blood pressure. This, on paper, is an effect of developed tolerance. So coffee can impact my blood pressure, my cerebral blood flow, my kidney function. Am I gonna die? When you're doing research on a specific food, substance, or drug, usually their impact on our risk of death just jumps out at you. Here's the case for coffee. This study observed 40,000 male and over 85,000 female coffee drinkers in a follow-up designed to assess coffee drinkers' risk of death from basically everything, but also highlighting cardiovascular disease and cancer. They adjusted for or accounted for smoking, physical activity, alcohol intake, parental history, the whole slew. It's a weird way to say that. They found that coffee drinkers' risk of death from all causes compared to those that don't drink coffee. Well, actually, run through this with me. Everything that's over 1 represents an increased risk. That is below 1 represents a decreased risk. Ready? Ladies first. 5 to 7 coffees a week, 7% decreased risk. 2 to 3 a day, 18% decreased risk. 4 to 5 a day, 26% decrease. 6 or more cups of coffee a day, 17% decreased risk. For the guys, respectively, 2% increase, 3% decrease, 7% decrease, and 20% decrease. Now, this is an observational study, so it is going to be based on some self-reports and a bunch of highly technical specific estimation equations. So like always, we take observational studies with a little grain of salt, but in general, this is great news for coffee drinkers, as across the board, you're gonna find a whole bunch of research papers that are just like this with similar results. Coffee, specifically caffeine, does impact the way the blood moves through the body. And you may find some health communicators basically siloing in on that effect and preaching to refrain from caffeine because of it. But as it stands, the research just doesn't support any long-term risks, so that view is most likely a little alarmist, and the science doesn't support it. So if we're talking strictly physiologically, we'd be hard-pressed to build a strong case for the dangers of caffeine use. The dark side of caffeine intake will always be a conversation revolving around dependency, right? So if you can't function, if you just can't operate without your fix of caffeine, right? Or if you're just a different person, like if you're nasty and your family and friends don't want to be around you, okay, like maybe we need to be talking about some kind of intervention. I suspect I don't need to bash us over the head about sleep and caffeine intake. Caffeine really is far from dangerous, but perhaps its most hazardous use case is in taking it in the hours nearing bedtime. Once we start messing with our sleep, we start undermining our health in more ways than we realize. So I always recommend anything that goes against proper sleep to be vigilant of it. So yes, there is a proper window of when we should be consuming caffeine, and it varies from person to person because we do get rid of it at different rates. A commonly reported half-life of caffeine is 5 hours, which means it takes 5 hours for whatever caffeine concentration in the blood to drop to 50%. Let's say we've been having coffee throughout the day and we have our final cup just after dinner, and by 8 p.m. we have, let's say, 200 milligrams of caffeine dancing around in the blood. We can kiss our chances of non-disrupted restorative sleep goodbye, as by 10 p.m. we'd still have well over 1 dose of caffeine still working about. If anything, I do suggest we all figure out how much caffeine we're taking in through the day. It's pretty fun to know, and it's actually kind of slick to be able to do the half-life math yourself. From what I gathered, loose numbers here, 100 to 150 milligrams is on the low end, above 150 up to 300 milligrams is the lower average, above 300 up to 400 milligrams is the upper average, and over 400 milligrams is high end. All right, I made this entire video and I am not even a coffee drinker. August 8th is my birthday and I got this mug and I figured I better start putting something in it, so I talking about coffee. Now, I do have a question for those that are the habitual coffee drinkers viewing this. Do you guys care about how or where you get your coffee, or is it really just like, I just need the coffee, right? I don't know where to start, and I need recommendations and advice. Drop me some in the comments below. I hope you guys gained some insight and perspective from this video. I'm gonna get about y'all way.